To achieve its current success, the Irish economic history has had a difficult past. Although today it is one of the countries with the highest income per capita in the world, it has endured true economic and social tragedies. At the end of the 19th century, Ireland experienced the so-called potato famine. Due to a terrible blight that devastated the island's potato plantations, the economy collapsed, leading to the deaths of no fewer than 1 million people and the migration of another million inhabitants, partly due to lack of aid from England. This situation led thousands of Irish people to embark on ships trying to cross the Atlantic to reach the United States. But the conditions of the journey were so appalling that the vessels were known as coffin ships, where the human traffickers of the time received payment for the transport, but only provided the people with minimal amounts of water and food. Furthermore, the voyages were carried out in overcrowded boats, where many died of hunger and others drowned due to the sinking of the overweight ships. As if that weren't enough, upon arriving in North America, the Irish were not received in the best possible way, as due to the massive migration, they were considered a risk to American national identity. Native Americans considered the Irish migrants to be lazy, alcoholic, violent, dirty, and poor. Due to economic need, the Irish had to perform the most precarious jobs to earn their food. Furthermore, on the island, for several centuries, it was English landowners who benefited from the harvest on Irish lands, which were obtained through the efforts of local workers, who received tremendously low wages for their labor. This situation generated a nationalist movement that sought independence from England at all costs. When Ireland began its independence process in 1922, its GDP per capita was only 60% of Britain's. Today, it is more than double that of its former tormentors, the English. But even in the 1990s, the Irish economy was considered one of the most backward in Europe, with a GDP below that of the so-called ugly ducklings of the European economy, such as Spain, Portugal, and Greece. In recent years, Ireland has managed to consolidate its position as the economy with the third highest income per capita, or GDP per capita, in the world, reaching $127,000 per year, surpassed only by Luxembourg in Europe, and with a GDP per capita more than double that of its former tormentors, the English, who only reach an average annual income of $58,000. This is undoubtedly the result of extraordinary economic growth, which can give us some clues about what works and what doesn't in achieving wealth creation. Although we must also acknowledge the opinions of those who argue that in this case, the figures may not reflect the true situation of a large part of the population, as the indicators may be inflated by the large number of multinationals operating in Ireland, which make multi-million-dollar transfers to their shareholders without leaving sufficient resources in the country for its development. To try to understand Ireland's economic development, we must go back in history to understand how it established itself as a nation, gaining independence from the United Kingdom. In the 19th century, there were already Irish nationalist groups with a Catholic tradition who sought the separation of the Irish island from the United Kingdom. But on that same northern island, there was a significant Protestant population that was quite loyal to the British royal family and did not want to be a minority in an independent Ireland. These movements led even British politicians to advocate for greater participation of the Irish population in the decisions of their populations. In 1910, Irish nationalist groups won a significant number of seats in the elections. This participation allowed them to pressure London to achieve greater autonomy for the Irish in their territories. The pressure was such that in 1912, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith introduced an Irish Home Rule Bill, but its discussion was postponed due to the outbreak of World War II. However, another group in Northern Ireland disagreed with this initiative and formed a militia that sought to block the Irish national government. The initiative managed to organize a group of more than 100,000 members, who even had long-range weapons. The Southern faction also took up arms to defend self-government, forming the paramilitary group known as the Irish Volunteers. The situation reached such a level of confrontation that the possibility of civil war was imminent. To try to calm the tensions, the British government proposed dividing Ireland into 6 parts, each still governed from London. 2 years after the start of the First World War, on April 24, 1916, a rebellion known as the Easter Rising erupted in Dublin, seeking Irish independence. However, the uprising was quickly suppressed by the British Army. with more than 110 deaths in the insurrection. Despite the failure of the military incursion, the political movement for independence grew stronger, and the Nationalist Party won 73 out of 105 seats in the 1918 elections. With this tremendous victory, the Irish deputies refused to go to London, and in 1919, they founded their own independent parliament in Dublin. In the first parliamentary session on January 21st, 1919, independence and the declaration of the Irish Republic were declared. The British rejected the decision, and the war began, in which the Irish formed the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, to wage a guerrilla war. The confrontations were intense, leading to the deaths of more than 500 people between 1920 and 1922. The situation for the English was not easy either, as they were going through a tremendous economic crisis following the First World War. After difficult negotiations, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in 1922, creating the Irish Free State, with its own government and army, although it remained part of the British Empire. But the conflict dragged on because the so-called IRA, or Irish Republican Army, disagreed with the agreement. The confrontation led to thousands of deaths, and it wasn't until 1937 that the Irish Constitution was drafted, founding the Irish Republic. During the Second World War, Ireland declared itself neutral throughout the conflict. Although Churchill hoped Ireland would join the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, so it could take advantage of the ports on Ireland's west coast, it ultimately remained neutral, also denying Axis members the ability to land troops on its territory. After the Second World War, Ireland's economic growth was rather mediocre. The focus was on protectionism, with low exports accounting for only 32% of GDP, with 75% of these dependent on England. The state intervened significantly in the economy, with rather limited results, averaging only 2% annual growth, well below the European average. This economic sluggishness led to mass migration, primarily to England and the United States. It wasn't until the 1990s that Ireland began to take off economically, but the economic turnaround wasn't a fluke. On the one hand, there were important reforms that allowed for government spending control and a reduction in corporate taxes. These results were based on the 1970s, when protectionist policies began to be gradually dismantled, seeking to promote exports and allowing free markets with tariff reductions and the trade agreement with England, which allowed hundreds of Irish goods to enter England. These policies encouraged foreign investment, and by the 1970s, industrial production was growing annually at rates above 4%, similar to that of its European counterparts. But this growth was not enough to bring the average Irish income on par with that of other countries on the old continent. A turning point was Ireland's entry into the European Economic Community in 1973, which was positive for trade. But alongside export growth, the government disproportionately increased public spending based on Keynesian policies, leading the country to successive fiscal crises, the first due to the oil crisis in 1973 and the second in 1979. In the late 1970s, the government continued to expand the size of the state, hiring massive amounts of public sector personnel in an attempt to reduce unemployment, in addition to increasing government transfers or subsidies and a road development plan. Due to the high spending, the government borrowed at extremely high rates, making debt repayments increasingly costly. The situation reached such a level that by 1986, Ireland had a debt equivalent to 116% of its GDP. Between 1973 and 1986, economic growth was again very low, averaging 1.9% per year, leading to high unemployment rates in some years approaching 25% and generating strong waves of migration once again. It was Prime Minister Charles Haughey who, in the late 1980s, began to accept the need for a much more pragmatic approach to economic management, moving away from the excesses of ideology. A series of reforms were required in an attempt to achieve economic survival. The situation was so critical that even the opposition supported the initiative. The country could no longer raise its already high taxes, and to avoid rising inflation and interest rates, the plan focused on reducing government spending. The squeeze may bear some resemblance to the chainsaw applied in Argentina by President Milei. The cuts between 1987 and 1988 were tremendous. The agricultural budget was cut by 18%, health by 6%, education by 7%, and military spending by 8%. A large number of public entities were cut, reducing the state payroll by more than 10,000 positions due to early retirements and voluntary redundancies. The cuts continued in 1988, achieving a 3% reduction in current spending and a 3% reduction in capital expenditures. These measures allowed the government to emerge from the fiscal crisis. Even by 1987, the primary deficit was no longer present, and the debt-to-GDP ratio began to decline, going from almost 120% of GDP in 1986 to 100% in 1990, a 20% reduction in less than 5 years. These spending cuts allowed for a smaller role for the state in the economy, as fewer public entities controlled the productive apparatus. This led to the Irish economy becoming one of the most economically free in the world. To prevent public spending from skyrocketing again at any time, the Maastricht Treaty was signed in 1992. Under this treaty, the state was required to maintain a fiscal deficit of less than 3% of GDP, and a projected debt-to-GDP ratio of 60% was targeted for 1999. These measures were intended to prevent any government from adopting expansionary monetary and inflationary policies. The measures were decisive, and average inflation in Ireland was less than 5% for 2 years, between 1989 and 1995. However, since 1995, the annual average inflation rate has been just 1.9%, one of the lowest in Europe. In addition to these measures, during the 1990s, personal and corporate tax rates were significantly reduced. Income tax was reduced from 35% to 32%, as were tariffs on imported goods, which were reduced from 7.5% to 6.9% in 1999. Corporate tax rates fell from 40% in 1996 to 24% in 2000. Thanks to these measures, Ireland is recognized as having the lowest tax rates in all of Europe, with the exception of Luxembourg. These changes led to the so-called golden decade of the Irish economy, during which, between 1990 and 1995, the economy grew at an average rate of over 5% annually. But the best part of the so-called Irish economic miracle occurred between 1996 and 2000, when Ireland achieved average annual economic growth of close to 10%. This allowed its GDP to grow by more than 50% in just 5 years, a milestone for European economies and the rest of the world, earning it the nickname Europe's Celtic Tiger economy. This fabulous growth in the 1990s allowed Ireland to reach and surpass the European average in living and income standards. Ireland's achievement of these indicators led many economic researchers to reaffirm their theories regarding the relationship between economic freedom and well-being indicators. While confirming that excessive public spending has a negative impact on economic and GDP growth, it is estimated that a 10% increase in government spending as a share of GDP leads to a reduction of 1 percentage point in a country's annual GDP growth. Ireland's success has been achieved thanks to the low tax burdens imposed by hundreds of multinationals. According to the OECD, Ireland has become the most productive country in the world. This contribution is due to multinationals such as Google, Microsoft, Pfizer, and Meta, which, thanks to their exorbitant profits, enable extremely high levels of productivity, as many of their goods leverage the intellectual property rights of their patents. However, for some economists, the real figures of the Irish economy are distorted precisely by these foreign companies that send hundreds of millions of dollars to their owners abroad. This ultimately does not mean that the high GDP per capita is reflected in greater wealth for Irish citizens. But on the other hand, there are other indicators that do reflect a tremendous improvement in the economic and social conditions of the Irish population. In the early 1980s, life expectancy at birth was 75.6 years for women and 70 years for men. By the mid-1990s, this life expectancy had already improved to 78.6 years for women and 73 years for men. By 2023, the average life expectancy in Ireland was 83 years, making it one of the countries with the best indicators in Europe. In the 1990s, the number of registered cars also increased by 40% thanks to the improvement in Irish purchasing power. But there is one indicator that many believe best reflects the country's progress, and it has to do with immigration indicators. Before the 1990s, Ireland had high immigration rates, but this trend reversed. Between 1996 and 1999, the country saw an annual population growth of 1.1%, even welcoming 47,500 migrants in 1998. Another factor that has undoubtedly had a tremendous impact on Ireland's economic growth has been foreign investment, which went from levels below 3% of GDP in the 1970s and 1980s to levels exceeding 20% in some years starting in the mid-1990s, which have been sustained in recent years. For many, the increase in foreign investment was due to a reduction in corporate taxes that allowed Ireland to position itself as one of the most attractive countries for multinationals. In 2015, Ireland achieved extraordinary economic growth of 18%, which was studied by various research centers because, for many, it was above the potential of a developed country. Some analysts considered these figures to be more like cosmetic transfers from multinationals. However, it is also true that a 44% increase in exports was behind it. The increase in exports has also allowed Ireland to improve its trade balance. It was precisely since the 1980s that Ireland managed to have more exports than imports, establishing itself as one of the economies with the best trade balance as a percentage of GDP. But more importantly, it has managed to sustain its positive balance, which in recent years has seen a growth in exports. Another factor that has undoubtedly positioned Ireland as a global business center is related to its human talent. Ireland has a highly educated English-speaking population. According to the OECD, Ireland has one of the 10 best education systems in the world. In the recent PISA test results, Ireland ranked second in the world in reading proficiency, with an average score of 516, much better than the English, which only managed 13th place, 22 points below. In mathematics and science, they ranked 11th, also surpassing the English by several points. Additionally, starting in 1995, the government sought to increase tertiary education coverage, achieving a tertiary education rate of up to 60% of the population, with the highest percentage of students completing higher education in all of Europe. Along the same lines, the improvement of human capital and exports were promoted thanks to Ireland's attractive tax system, which attracted foreign direct investment for new research and development. Free trade zones were created where companies could conduct technological research and development. The tariffs recently imposed by Trump could have a negative impact on Irish economic growth in the coming years, but the resilience of the economy will likely allow it to continue growing at rates close to 3% in 2025 and 2026. Remember that in the video description, you'll find a link to the best course for learning technical and fundamental analysis for investing in stocks. You'll also find a link to the best platform for buying stocks on the stock exchange, regulated in the United States.